As we've been working our way through Paul's letter to the Galatians, one of the things that is very, very quickly apparent is that Paul is convinced that this church is in the middle of a crisis. There's a problem. It's a serious problem. And if you kind of read through the whole letter, and you may have noticed even in this passage today that Paul's tone is really striking. It's really kind of aggressive. He's not holding back. He's got some points to make, and he's one of those guys who doesn't mind making his points rather forcefully, maybe even more forcefully than we would prefer from time to time, but that's what he does here. There's a crisis. He's got some pretty strong words for them. Now, up until this point, it hasn't been especially clear what the crisis was. This is one of the challenges of reading half a correspondence. You know, like you're kind of riding in the car with somebody and maybe they answer the phone and you hear half the conversation and you're thinking, that's kind of weird. And, you know, you don't have the whole story. You don't have the whole context. You've only got this one part and you got to put some pieces together. Maybe they'll fill you in afterwards. Maybe not. Remains to be seen. Nevertheless, we've got what Paul says to the Galatians. In his version of the story, we don't have what he says, what they've said to him, or how they wrote back, or how they responded, or even how it all got kicked off. So we're kind of looking through this letter, and we're putting the pieces together, and he doesn't just give us a report, like here's what happened, 21st century Christians in Galatia, so that you kind of know what's going on. We just got to read through and kind of catch some of the pieces. Well, in chapter 2, we begin to get some clues at what's really going on here. It's going to come clear. You may have noticed he talks about circumcision a lot, and that's not really a topic that comes up in modern day churches all that frequently. He's given us some clues to what the conflict is about. The conflict is so strong that Paul is even willing to use the language of false gospel. Now, those aren't words that come out of my mouth all that often, but Paul here is willing to use that kind of language in chapter 1. If somebody on my team preaches a false gospel to you, or if an angel from heaven shows up and preaches a false gospel, pay no attention. So that's strong language, and it gives us a clue that for Paul, this is really crucial. This is really, really crucial. It has potential. This conflict has potential not only to divide the church, but from where Paul stands, it has potential to disrupt the mission of the church beyond the community that is kind of the ground zero for the conflict. So what's the conflict? What's the false gospel? What's Paul dealing with? Well, we can put some of the pieces together today. The answer may surprise us. Chances are, if you've been in a church very long, you've run into some sort of conflict here and there. They come along easily, they show up. Josh is smiling at me because, it happens, right? Things can be going along nicely, and all of a sudden, boom, like there's a thing and it's happening. That's one reason I want to say, as this church is making decisions about the future, the shared vision and unanimous commitment to a single pathway is not to be taken for granted. Because when churches begin to focus on kind of inter-community conflicts, we begin to stop focusing on our mission to our neighbors and the nations. Right? If I'm arguing with you, I'm not embodying Jesus and declaring the beauty of the good news of his perfect love to my neighbors. Right? There's only so much time in the week. And the question is, how am I using that time? And so Paul, whatever the conflict here is, takes it very seriously. Now, churches today fight over different things than Paul is dealing with. Conflicts, you got the cliche color of the carpet thing, and churches are constantly embattled over styles of worship, even after decades of kind of churches just doing different things. There's conflict. In the first century, they fought over things like circumcision and whether non-Jewish people had to get circumcised to be Christians. Now, that makes color of the carpet seem not quite such a big deal, I would imagine. And I don't remember, I've been a pastor for, I think, 17 or so years now, and I've never once in that whole time, as many conflicts and potential conflicts as we've navigated in various churches, I've never once had this conflict show up in a church. Like nobody's ever come along and said, hey, I think when people join the church, they should undergo this medical procedure. Like that hasn't come up, and I'm grateful for it. But that is what comes up here. We begin to get the clue because Paul tells us about Titus, who's not Jewish. He's of Greek descent. And apparently there's some folks in Jerusalem who want him to undergo the procedure, the medical procedure. It's also a religious procedure, ritual. Paul refuses to do that, and he sees it as a gospel issue. So we're going to dig into that more deeply. For Paul, approaching that issue has potential to disrupt the unity of the church and the mission of the church. It has potential to disrupt the community and the community's goals, purposes, and aims. And so there's some principles underneath that the Galatians have to wrestle with and that we've got to wrestle with, even if they're applied differently. Even if they're applied differently. And for Paul, it has to do with the way that the community and the mission are interwoven together. For Paul, gospel-focused mission is forged in gospel-formed community. And if the community isn't formed by the gospel, if the community isn't rooted in the gospel and cultivated in the gospel and committed to the gospel and unswervingly devoted to the good news about who Jesus is, if that's not the driving, central, defining thing, you may do some mission activities, but you will not be a gospel-focused missional church. So how does this emerge? What does that look like? We're talking about the mission and the community and how they relate. What's going on here? Well, Paul sort of offers his own mission as a case study, doesn't he? And where does his mission start? It starts with a calling. Like Jesus shows up for Paul. And remember, Paul was a nasty guy. He was the kind of guy who went around killing people like us or hauling them off in chains or all those kinds of things, right? Like he was aggressively opposed to a church that was integrating non-Jewish people into it and who took Jesus as the Messiah. So he's aggressively opposed to that, and he describes that earlier in the letter. And Jesus shows up to Paul on that road. And Paul has this radical experience of his life's just turned from one direction to another. And all of a sudden, instead of persecuting the way of Jesus, he becomes one of its greatest advocates. Starts planting churches and preaching the gospel, and he's advancing the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. But he's not a solo gig, is he? He's not out there by himself, just kind of like, you guys in Jerusalem, you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing. Now, he doesn't go up right away, but he does eventually get in there. He's got some preparation. He's got to learn some things. He's got to sort some things out. But eventually he goes to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem and says, hey, are we on the same page here? Do we have gospel unity? Are we focused on the same message and the same mission? Is this where we are? And he submits himself to them in what may be a surprising way to us. Because we kind of live in a world where the people say things like, hey, if you got a call, you do you, right? Like you do you, and Paul going up to see if his message and mission and his calling aligns with the Jerusalem leaders are very different visions of the world. He goes in to submit himself, to offer himself, to say, like, am I running in vain? Like, am I wasting my energy? Do I have the story wrong? Like, I think Jesus has called me. Jesus is at work in my life. I think I'm on the right path, but I want to make sure that I'm not going through the motions or expending my energy in a way that's not effective for the gospel. And so he offers himself to be evaluated by them and to listen to them. And what do? They recognize God's grace in his life. And so we begin to see like how ministry, and all of us kind of have different sorts of ministry. Some of us devote full time to the ministry of the church. Others devote kind of part-time to the ministry of the church, though it probably never feels that way. Others devote sort of servant volunteer energy to the ministry of the church, and there are different roles and different responsibilities involved in that, but it's all kind of offered at one central mission. But it all sort of has to face and deal with and stand up against the question, yes, I see gifts and graces and calling even, but how does that align with the purposes and aims of what Jesus has called this community to do? Is it a good fit? Like, is there grace in your life? And sometimes, like, people come along and they feel super called, and there ain't a lot of grace in their lives. And we have to kind of say, that's a great idea, but maybe we should think about what that looks like over here. Because a calling isn't enough. Not here. When I first went to the denomination and said, hey, I think I'm called to be a pastor, they're like, that's great. We got a pretty long process where we'll figure out if you really are and whether you have what it takes. Sometimes we're still trying to figure that out, I think. God calls, and then God puts the community in a place to confirm the calling. And that's exactly what happens here. Paul says, hey, I'm called. And Peter and James and John say, all right, let's talk. Talk to us about the gospel. Talk to us about your vision for Jewish-Gentile relations. And they see God's... Talk to us about your commitment to ministry with the poor. Like, talk to us about what you want to do, your church planting goals. Like, let's hear it. And they see in his life the evidence of grace. They met for a few days. And they say, let's shake hands, brother. We're on the same page. And we want to support your ministry. You go take the gospel to the nations. And so you've got this community in Jerusalem that the Pauline mission emerges out of. Right? That's the thing to see. The gospel-forged community in Jerusalem, where Peter's already experienced Pentecost and he's preached the gospel and people are coming to Jesus. Non-Jewish people are coming to Jesus for the first time in dramatic ways. And all that's happening. There's a community in Jerusalem that is unswervingly committed to the gospel. Right? They're being opposed. They're facing persecution. We've read through Acts together. We know like these guys did not have a smooth pathway. There were some challenges involved. But they're committed to the gospel. Their community is forged by a commitment to the good news about who Jesus is, about his death and about his resurrection and about his lordship. And out of that gospel-forged community, something grows. What grows? The mission of the church grows. Like missions don't just sort of happen. It's like, oh, I fell out of bed this morning. I think I'll go start a new mission. No, they grow out of communities that are deeply committed to the gospel. And we see Paul, and we see Peter, James, and John, the others in Jerusalem come together, and there's a community. Paul says, I want to offer myself to you to hear from you about what's the right way to proceed. Make sure I'm not running in vain. And they bless that. They see the evidence of God's work in his life. So out of that community, what grows? The mission grows. And what happens? Paul goes and begins launching more communities.